All right, we're now talking about section 7 in chapter 15 on the autonomic nervous system with the interactions between the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions of the autonomic nervous system. Learning objectives for this section should be able to discuss the nature of autonomic tone and its effects, explain dual innervation, describe the antagonistic and cooperative effects of dual innervation, describe the systems innervated only by the sympathetic division and how they function. With autonomic tone, most effectors are innervated by both divisions of the ANS, and both continuously release neurotransmitter. They generate autonomic tone. In some instances, and this is kind of a balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic response, essentially more of a resting state. In some instances, only one division controls the status of an effector, like blood vessels that are usually in a partially constricted state due to sympathetic tone, also called vasomotor tone. Vessel constricts if the sympathetic activity increases. Vessel dilates if sympathetic activity decreases. Vagal tone continually decreases heart rate, which is obviously by decrease meaning a parasympathetic response. Dual innervation, however, is when an organ receives input from both sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Two divisions can have antagonistic or cooperative effects. Antagonistic effects would be obviously when the divisions oppose each other, antagonistic. Control of heart rate is an example of this, with parasympathetic activity slowing the heart rate and sympathetic activity increasing the heart rate. Cardiac cells have both cholinergic and adrenergic receptors. As an example here, kind of you can see all the different areas of the body that have both parasympathetic and sympathetic innervations, basically a dual innervation possibility with the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions innervating many of the same organs. Due to specific different neurotransmitters and receptor types of effectors, may have a different response. But you can see the eye, the salivary glands, or the eyes we should say, the heart, the lungs, the stomach, the pancreas, liver and gallbladder, bladder, and the genitals all have potentially dual innervation responses. As far as further antagonistic effects, control of muscular activity of the GI tract. Parasympathetic activity increases the GI tract motility, whereas sympathetic activity decreases motility. From the standpoint of when you are in a fight or flight state, sympathetic response, exercise, energy, a stimulant, your ability to digest food goes down because it's a sympathetic response, whereas a parasympathetic response is going to aid digestive capacity, and it's going to be lowering your otherwise your bodily responses for energy and output, which is why it's often said you don't want to eat a large meal and expect to go exert yourself significantly, because you have two competing systems. It's going to cause you problems. You're going to be lacking in both. The GI smooth muscle cells have both types of receptors. Control of pupil diameter in the iris of the eye. The parasympathetic activity decreases the pupil diameter, whereas the sympathetic activity dilates it. The parasympathetic fibers innervate circular iris muscles, and sympathetic fibers innervate the radial iris muscles. Cooperative effects, however, you see when you have the parasympathetic and sympathetic stimulation having different effects that are part of an overall response, like male sexual function, the penis erection due to parasympathetic activity, and ejaculation due to sympathetic activity. Systems that are controlled only by the sympathetic division, you can see opposing effects that can be achieved without dual innervation, like the blood vessels constricting with increased sympathetic activity. They also dilate with decreased sympathetic activity. Okay. Examples of effectors innervated only by the sympathetic division: the sweat glands in the trunk, the rectus pili muscles in the skin, and the adrenal medulla neurosecretory cells. Raynaud's syndrome is a sudden constriction of the small arteries of digits, results in loss of normal hue of distal skin, is accompanied by pain, triggered by cold or emotional stress due to exaggerated local sympathetic response, and it's more common in women. So what did you learn? How does autonomic tone permit the control of blood vessel diameter by sympathetic innervation? What are the antagonistic effects of the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions on the heart? How do the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions exhibit cooperative effects on the male reproductive system? What are the body structures innervated by the sympathetic division only? And how does the cardiovascular reflex affect blood pressure? And we're going to go into autonomic reflexes just because it's a very short section for us here, kind of combining both sections. We're talking about the visceral reflexes, the internal organs. We have a pre-programmed response to a stimulus generated by reflex arc, which we obviously have spoken about before. The arc includes the receptor, sensory relay to the CNS, CNS integration center, and motor neuron and effector. And the ANS effectors are cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glands. Cardiovascular reflex, blood pressure. There's stretch receptors in the vessel walls that respond to pressure elevation. Signals are sent to the cardiac center in the medulla oblongata, and they inhibit sympathetic and activate parasympathetic output to the heart, obviously trying to lower it. They slow the heart rate, decrease the volume of blood ejected, and decreasing blood pressure. As far as gastrointestinal reflex, defecation, sensory neurons in the rectum respond to stretch by fecal matter. Signals are sent to the spinal cord. Signals are sent through motor neurons that stimulate the rectum to contract and internal anal sphincter to relax. The micturition reflex, urination, essentially, is a stretch receptor signal when the bladder fills with urine, and signals are sent to the sacral spinal cord. In an infant, this results in reflexive contraction of smooth muscles in the bladder and relaxation of urinary sphincters. Once the child is toilet trained, this signals through the pons allow for voluntary control of the external urethral sphincter. So we have this simple visual here for us for our autonomic reflexes. Looking here at the urinary bladder, which stretches as it fills with urine here, and you can see your ureters here. It stimulates and activates, or the stimulus activates this receptor, and the nerve signals are transmitted along the sensory neuron, of course, to the integration center of the spinal cord, where the nerve signals are processed to this inner neuron here in the integration center, and then the afferent response is sent out, sent out here. In this case, the pelvic splanchnic nerve, also splanchnic nerve or a splenic nerve, a lot of different possibilities there. Most commonly splanchnic nerve. Nerve signals are transmitted along the motor neurons via the splanchnic nerve, pelvic splanchnic nerves to an effector, to the postganglionic axon here. And then the effector responds to smooth muscle, with smooth muscle in the bladder wall contracting and the internal urethral sphincter relaxing. So you can go to the bathroom. As far as clinical view with autonomic dysreflexia, this causes the blood pressure to rise profoundly. It stimulates a sympathetic reflex, causes the systemic vasoconstriction and large increase in blood pressure. It's caused by hyperactivity of the ANS after a spinal cord injury. The initial response to injury is spinal shock with loss of autonomic reflexes. An abnormal response to lack of innervation is denervation hypersensitivity, like involuntary relaxation of the internal urethral sphincter due to spinal cord reflex. So what did you learn? How does the cardiovascular reflex affect blood pressure? And that is our chapter 15 focus on autonomic nervous system. We'll come back soon with chapter 16 for the senses.